So, overlapping with and eventually conquering Minoan civilization is the sort of other culture emerging in this area we are calling Greece, that is called Mycenaean Civilization. And again, a lot of the terms that historians use now actually were sort of first introduced by archaeologists who were engaged in excavating these regions. So, obviously, Mycenaean comes from the palace at Mycenae. As we read in the Iliad, the king of Mycenae is Agamemnon. Whether or not Agamemnon existed, probably not, but clearly sort of evidence of a culture similar to, but in some respects much different from what we see on Minoan Crete. So the dates here are obviously a little fluid. We do know that this culture of mainland Greece sort of emerges and really sort of reaches heights around 1500, and then by 1150 really goes into a period of decline. This is an image of the what remains of the citadel at Mycenae. So for a very long time, most scholars did not believe that the individuals and events and the civilization that you see in the works of Homer, so the Iliad and the Odyssey, were in fact historically based. They thought it was poetry, it was entertainment, it was all fiction. And it really wasn't until the late 1800s that a German industrialist named Heinrich Schliemann was able to find enough physical evidence to sort of challenge a lot of those beliefs. And so Schliemann was a businessman who became very, very wealthy and had a lot of resources, financial resources at his disposal. And so in the 1870s, he's able to use his fortune to really begin large excavation efforts at what he believed to be Troy, and then at the citadel of Mycenae. He, like many German boys in the 1800s, grew up reading Homer. That's how you learn Greek. And he was convinced that what was described in the Iliad was, in fact, in some degree, historically grounded. And so he used the Iliad to try and find one of the reasons why scholars thought this was a myth is because they could never find a settlement that sort of was consistent with Homer's description of Troy, something that large, something that elaborate, something that powerful. And so Schliemann used the Iliad to sort of guide him to these places. And then he was able to obviously, we cannot pinpoint those individuals or those particular events, but he was able to establish enough evidence of some sort of Bronze Age culture very similar to what you see depicted in Homer. And that's Schliemann on top of the Lion's Gate at Mycenae. So he first began to try and find the city of Troy. Now, he wasn't the first to look in this particular location. So you can see Troy is actually located in what today is Turkey, so Anatolia, Asia Minor. So it's not in mainland Greece, which makes a lot of sense when you think about the description of all the groups that are fighting together that are sort of described collectively as Achaeans. And so they then invade, so they cross a body of water, they have lots of ships, so it makes sense that this would be the target of that attempt at conquest. And there was a previous archaeologist in the 1850s who did begin excavations in this area. There was no longer sort of a settled population there. It had been abandoned for some time. But he didn't have Schliemann's resources, and so he wasn't really able to make significant progress. So it's only when Schliemann arrives in 1872, 1873, and really subjects this area to massive excavation that they find enough evidence to determine that this would have been the city of Troy. So this is sort of a visual of what Homer's Troy looks like, right? So you have sort of the citadel of Troy and sort of an extensive city within significant walls. You have the Scamandrian plain, so the Scamander River flows in between there. It's right on the water, so as a port city, this would have made a lot of sense at the time, though that sort of inlet is no longer there. It's been filled up in time. And then again, descriptions of the Iliad indicate the presence of a lot of ships for the Greek camp. So some of these places sort of correspond to what you see described there. And in his excavations, he did find significant indications of great wealth associated with the city. In particular, he found this sort of collective of buried sort of goods that he called Priam's treasure. And in particular, the headdress, the diadem, the gold diadem that the woman is wearing, or the figure is wearing, he associated with Helen. So using a lot of these sort of allusions to the individuals in the Iliad who may or may not have existed, but this was probably not their gold, but it does reflect a lot of wealth within the city walls and did give him that sort of ammunition to make this argument. He also found copper vessels, copper shields, lots of different sort of implements of war as well. So this is sort of what we know of now. This sort of schematic shows you. So the earliest foundation of Troy, as they continue to excavate down from where the blue is sort of the surface before the excavation. When they dig all the way down, they find layers of settlement here, going back all the way to 3000 BC. And within those various layers of settlement, they can use sort of modern technology to sort of give an approximate date to that layer of settlement. And so most scholars agree that if there was in fact a large scale conflict between members of the Greek world and inhabitants of Troy, it probably corresponded to, you can see the Roman numbers here correspond to these layers, 6 or 7. 6 shows evidence of destruction as a result of a large scale earthquake. And then 7 shows evidence of destruction by probably conquest. So a lot of fire, a lot of physical violence and damage. Those 2 layers probably date to about 1184 BC, around that time, which would have been consistent with the date of the conflict that Homer describes. So the very end of the Mycenaean period. Now, this is still... there's still a lot of differences of opinion among scholars as to which of these layers would have been the layer that was in place during the Trojan War. There's also a lot of disagreement about the size of the settlement, sort of especially beyond the citadel, how extensive it was. So this is by no means sort of definitive, but it does sort of suggest that some of what Homer describes was in fact in place at the time. So after Hisarlik or Troy, he turns his attention to mainland Greece, and then clearly, right, he's trying to find this history that's depicted in the Iliad. So a natural sort of target of these excavations is the city at Mycenae. Mycenae is really prominent as a citadel and a settlement area during this period. It's not really going to remain super important in Greece moving forward. So in part, he benefits from the lack of sort of building over, or in a lot of instances, you can see these large stones that are used to make this main entrance into the town, that Lion's Gate. So there are 2 sort of lions. Their heads are gone, but you can still see their bodies. A lot of these stones would have been repurposed if settlement had really continued in this area. And because it's largely abandoned, it's sort of left standing, and he is able to excavate. What he finds is sort of evidence of his central residence, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Religious buildings that were used for sort of cult ceremonies, and then workshops. So these are all within sort of the main citadel. And then you also have this lower town area where there's several dozen probably residences for government officials, or maybe sort of members of the elite aristocracy. Also commercial buildings that would have been used to sort of house storage, and also government officials. And then outside the walls, you have this elaborate network of roads and dams and bridges. So it is a pretty elaborate settlement. One of the things that you'll notice amongst all the these larger settlements I'm going to talk about is they all, except for Pylos, have extensive fortifications. So a much different sort of configuration of what you have in Minoan Crete. So he begins his excavations into this series of graves, which are known as the shaft graves. And there are a couple of these. This one is shaft grave A, and it dates to about 1550 BC. So at the early end of this Mycenaean civilization. These shaft graves were later enclosed within the walls. The walls were probably built towards, walls were extended at the later part of the building, and then these shaft graves, which were originally outside of the walls, became inside the walls. So 6 graves total, about 19 bodies. Based upon some of the grave goods that they found, the conclusion is that these were probably members of the sort of elite aristocracy. There are these stelae you can see kind of around the rim of that first inner circle. So these are erected stones, and they depict scenes of warriors and chariots and spears. So again, probably referencing the military function of the individuals buried in these shaft graves. And so a lot of the grave goods then do provide further evidence of the type of militaristic culture where sort of the successful warrior was sort of the ultimate in society, like we see in the Iliad. And these bronze daggers are one example of this. So these are gold, but also sort of a special way to draw the designs. The one on the top shows hunting lions. And one of the things we also see in it is what's called a figure of 8 shield. So very similar to the shield that Homer describes Ajax, larger Ajax, using when he fights. But these sort of scenes of hunting, of engagement in warfare are really very typical of this period. One of the sort of mysteries to scholars was, how come you can have so much gold? There's a high concentration of gold in a lot of these grave goods, usually ceremonial, because it's not native to this region. You don't find gold in Mycenae or around Mycenae, or even in this part of the Greek world. And so eventually what a lot of scholars have determined was that they're actually trading with people in Northern Europe. So a lot of the initial sort of suspicion was that they would have been trading with Egypt or with people in the Mediterranean, but they're able to establish trade routes that go up north. So just to give you kind of a better idea of what we're talking about then, the map you can see. So Mycenae is the one that's sort of subject to the most excavation by Schliemann, but there are other of these large sort of fortresses or palaces that existed during this period. So Pylos, which is associated with King Nestor from the Iliad. You also have Tiryns. Athens is already sort of in the mix here. Thebes and Orchomenos, and then Gia. So these are these are large sort of fortresses that they've been able to locate and sort of dominate this Mycenaean civilization. And one of the things that all of these structures have in common is this central megaron. And so you can see this illustration here. It was like a 3-part room with sort of an antechamber and then an open chamber, and then that central hearth that was surrounded by those columns, and then that's where you would have found a throne. So very common to all of these different large sort of fortified structures. And also kind of similar to what we saw in Knossos as well. And so these also provide further insight into the type of political system that you would have had that I'll talk about in a second. So these are some sort of diagrams. So you can see the one on the left is Mycenae. And so you have the central megaron, and then outside you sort of have a cult center, and then some other sort of buildings and rooms. That's obviously all enclosed within a wall. On the right, you have the large palace that's found in Pylos is much different and is sort of more reminiscent of Knossos or some of the palaces you found on Crete. And another sort of similarity too is the lack of walls. There are no fortifications in Pylos. Extensive excavation of Pylos has indicated a lot of these rooms can kind of reveal their purpose. So you do have sort of the central megaron. You also have some places that house sort of weapons. One of the rooms actually they found sort of a terracotta bathtub in it. So again, similarities to what you see on Crete. They also, there are 2 different rooms where they found tablets, and I'll show you some examples of those tablets in a second. So sort of like an archive room where they stored their I want to say documents, but tablets. One room they found like 3,000 drinking vessels. So clearly they would host feasts. So similar to what you see again on Minoan Crete. All of these palaces have elaborate interior frescoes. These are recreations, so they're not quite this well preserved, but they also give us insight into this Mycenaean culture. A very common thing are women participating in ritual processions. And really interestingly, some scholars have suggested that women during the Mycenaean period had the potential to be much more sort of actively involved in governing in the political system than moving forward, particularly if you're talking about a monarchy. And again, we see this kind of reflected in the Iliad. A king has a queen, and then that gives her some access to power that in sort of the later evolutions of these political systems in Greece, women lose, and they no longer play these very public roles like this woman is obviously doing. You can also notice sort of the decoration of her skirt is really similar to the decoration of the this snake goddess that I showed you in the Minoan lecture. So overlap, similarities there. And then these scenes of men fighting, obviously, again, sort of giving us a visual glimpse into how they depicted their society. So a second series of burials, a much different form of burial, are called these tholos tombs, and they're like kind of like beehives. These are dated to the very end of this Mycenaean period, so around 1250. This one in particular, Schliemann excavated, and he called it the Treasury of Atreus. He believed that he had found the burial chamber of Agamemnon himself, which based on the dating of what was inside, it does not correspond. So whatever elite individual was buried here, they were very powerful and wealthy, but they were not Agamemnon. So these are interesting structures. They're 46 feet in diameter, and the interior of the chamber has a ceiling of about 20 feet. They were sort of buried then over by these earthen mounds. Many of them, there are a number of these tholos tombs, but some had been raided already, so most of the grave goods were gone. But they are significant constructions, or these concentric circles of stone, all leading up to the top then. And based on the grave goods, as well as how elaborate this burial chamber is for an individual, Schliemann concluded accurately that it was probably a king maybe who was buried in this particular tholos tomb. And one of the reasons why he concluded that is because on the skeleton was this gold filigree mask that probably took sort of an imprint of the individual's face. And so it's a burial mask. It's made out of gold, so reflecting the wealth of the individual. He calls it the Mask of Agamemnon because he thinks he found the burial of Agamemnon. He did it, but it does, again, sort of reinforce some of what we see in the Iliad. So in terms of the economic systems, it's sort of a mixed bag. You do see, especially in a place like Pylos, the redistributive economy that we saw on Crete. So you have these large storage areas where a lot of goods are brought to the palace by those who are actually engaged in the labor, and then probably sort of redistributed during feasts or during periods of famine. But that's probably sort of unique to Pylos. In other places like Mycenae, you don't really see those large storage chambers or any evidence of sort of the collection of agricultural produce. What we do see in a place like Mycenae is evidence of the production of goods on an actually fairly impressive scale. They're making perfumes by mixing various sort of scents like lavender with olive oil. They're also producing textiles. There's a lot of pottery. You also have metal workers who are producing various sort of vessels and jewelry. There would be potters and there would be scribes. We do know that this is a very hierarchical society and that slave labor was sort of pervasive throughout this culture. And so it's a lot of that labor, the industrial labor as well as the agricultural labor, is actually produced by these slaves. We do also see evidence of extensive trade networks, and you can see in the map here, particularly some places in the north, but Italy. There are also, you see a lot of evidence of trade with Egypt and some places in the Middle East. But in part, this is an economy that relies on conquest. So that's how you make slaves. You make slaves because you go to war, you defeat the enemy, and then you enslave the women and children. So that would have been a really sort of common feature of the society. And also conquest, right? So some of that gold comes from trade, some of that gold comes from conquest. And again, that's very clearly illustrated in the Iliad. This is a hierarchical society. This sort of distribution of the spoils of war is in part what sort of links this warrior elite to the individual leaders within society. So the political system we don't know much about. Again, we do know that it's extremely stratified. We know from some writings during the period that there was an individual who they call a wanox, who probably was some sort of king. He probably had some religious duties, so the king would perform important sacrifices. He would play a central role in various rituals. Ancient Bronze Age Greek religion, with the gods and the goddesses, you do have priests and priestesses, but everybody sort of engages in these religious activities. Probably evidence of a warrior elite, and so it's that fighting that gives them status within society, both because they're protecting, but also because a direct result of fighting is the acquisition of goods when you're victorious. And again, we see in the writings reference to a particular war leader, so a special sort of position of someone who would lead the army when they were off on conquest. There's also a group in society described as landholders or collectors. They may be synonymous with this warrior elite, but probably very, very wealthy. In some instances, controlling lots and lots of land and lots of sort of sheep, as described in these documents. You also have artisans who are the ones sort of producing the goods, doing the metalworking, that are doing the weaving. And then government officials who sort of assist the king in bringing in sort of, we see evidence of taxation, and so it would have been in kind, not in money, because there's no money yet. So they would have kept track of how many sort of pithoi of olive oil comes in, how many bushels of grain are coming in, and then obviously at the bottom, supplying a lot of the labor is the sort of group of slaves. So we saw on Crete evidence of the earliest writing system, Linear A. This is Linear B. Because we can't translate Linear A, we're not quite sure how much of a connection there is, but we do find these Linear B tablets in the Palace of Knossos towards the end of occupation there. These are two different sort of stages in the evolution of this script. On the right, you can see the earliest is much more pictorial, and then on the left, it becomes syllabic, right? So it loses that sort of sense of an image, so you can no longer see a horse, you can no longer see a man, and it begins to take more of just a shape, more of the way sort of a modern alphabet works. And so Linear B, there are thousands of tablets, particularly in the palace at Pylos. Pylos was eventually abandoned, probably due to fire, because in those chambers that I talked about before, there are hundreds of these tablets that were burned, that were in a fire, but obviously that just baked them and sort of preserved them. And then we have tablets from across sort of the Mycenaean world, so we know this was pretty widespread. In the 1830s, a woman named Alice Kober, an American woman, transcribed over 180,000 of these tablets and tried to sort of make sense out of them, find similarities, begin to decipher them. And she was one of the first to advance this idea that it was a syllabic structure, that it was a writing system made out of syllables that eventually become recognizable. One of the questions is, is there any connection between this language and Greek, the Greek language? And for the longest time, scholars didn't think so, but in part because of her work and then the work of Michael Ventris, who was at Cambridge in the 50s, they were able to begin to translate some of this script, and through that translation find similarities with classical Greek. So it was in fact a predecessor of the Greek language. The other thing that it reflects, so there's no literature in this writing. It's more descriptions of ceremonies. It gives us better understanding of the economic system because it's sort of the taxation element. We also get some description of geography because it talks about different places. And it does give us some sense, again, of that political structure. More than anything for scholars, though, it explained the relationship between Crete and Mycenae, so Minoan and Mycenaean civilization. Sir Arthur Evans, who was the archaeologist who excavated Knossos, believed that, so you see some of these similarities between Minoan and Mycenaean culture, and he advanced the argument that at one point the Minoans conquered mainland Greece. And what these tablets actually did was kind of reverse that. So the final sort of conclusive element that had been lacking, that proved that the Mycenaeans actually conquered Crete and for a while resided in Knossos, and they brought this writing with them to the Palace of Knossos, which is why you find those Linear B tablets there. So ultimately, though, we do know that like the Minoans, the Mycenaean civilization, so the civilization, these sort of warrior tribes with kings and very hierarchical, disappears. And there's a lot of speculation as to why. And it's still very inconclusive. So some scholars have suggested a climate change that resulted in extended drought that disrupted economic patterns and made them very sort of vulnerable and resulted in the abandonment of these large centers of population like Mycenae, like Pylos, like Gia. We also see evidence around 1200 of earthquakes. So they may explain evidence of ruin, evidence of destabilization that you see when these palaces were abandoned. Another theory are shifts in warfare, that sort of the elite warrior who drove the chariot was replaced by the type of infantry you see depicted here. And so that sort of evened out some of this stratification within society and undermine the aristocratic culture that was sort of the foundation here. Another hypothesis are foreign invasions. So we do know from across the Mediterranean, around this region, there are descriptions of sort of pirates on the sea, these marauders who are invading. They affect Egypt, they affect other places as well. And so we do see some evidence in some of these inscriptions about watching for people on the sea that suggest they're being attacked. Probably the explanation is a combination of all of these, but we do know that by sort of 1150, 1000, we no longer see these outlines of this sort of prosperous, thriving civilization.